Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Project Insight Professional Development Series webinar on Waterfall or Agile, which one works best, which methodology works best. I'm Steve West. I'm CEO of Project Insight. Project Insight's project portfolio management solution. We're here to automate your work and make your life easier using Project Insight. Real quick, just before we start, all the participants will be on mute. You guys can use the chat feature or comment feature on the right side of the screen to ask any questions. At the end of the training session, you'll get a link that you can use to redeem for a PDU, but you do need to be here to the end in order to earn the hour PDU for this. So before we get started, I'm going to introduce you to Diane Buckley Altwies. She's our trainer today. We've been working with her for a number of years, but Diane has 30 years experience as a project manager in insurance, financial services, healthcare industry. She's co-authored 3 different books on project management. She also teaches and consults for organizations on various project management topics like this one today. She is a lively, engaged speaker, and she does professional meetings. She was honored in 2013 as a fellow of the PMI Orange County chapter. She has a PMP and an MBA in finance and marketing, BA in production management from the University of South Florida. So welcome, Diane. We're very honored to have you with all of your accomplishments.
Well, thanks, Steve. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. Well, welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. It's going to be a fun little session on talking about Waterfall and Agile and which one works best. So today we're going to cover a lot of things. It's going to be a lot more from theoretical standpoint, and we definitely want to get your input on how you are utilizing the tools out there. And are you using pure Agile methods? Are you using Waterfall methods? Are you using some combination of it? We see a lot of organizations struggle to try to figure out what works best. So today we're gonna start with a little bit of the history, go over that. We're gonna then talk a bit about the differences and compare some of the features of Waterfall versus Agile, and then talk about the hybrid approach. And Steve's gonna show us some things you can do on the Project Insight tool, which is very exciting. So definitely stay around for that. And then we're gonna talk about when you really want to use Agile from a pure perspective, what kinds of projects are the best ones for that? And then maybe help you in planning your own projects and figuring out what to consider as you decide which method to use. A lot of times organizations want to do one or the other, but we'll talk about how you can have an Agile and a Waterfall hybrid kind of approach. So looking forward to having this conversation. And as Steve said, please put your comments in the chat. He'll be monitoring that. We'll be talking back and forth through the entire session here today.
Yeah, definitely. We're excited to go over all this because, as my experience out there is that for a while there, like everything Agile everyone wanted to be 100% Agile. So it's kind of good to go over when it's appropriate, when it isn't appropriate. But for a while there, it was super popular to just say, hey, we're an Agile company and therefore everything, we should do it all that way. Maybe not.
Right. Yeah, the pendulum always has to swing, right? So now it's got to swing something that makes sense. But anyway, so we're going to touch a little bit on the history and where software methodologies have come from. So back in the 1950s, which most of you probably were not around then, basically, the U.S. Navy started putting tools in place like PERT and the work breakdown structure, that WBS you've heard. And that was kind of the start of a methodology, a structured methodology for developing software, because software was just being developed then. And then in the early 70s, between the 70s and 80s, Waterfall became kind of the standard. But mid-70, there was some discussion and some thought leadership out there about having a more adaptive software development lifecycle, because people were feeling like it took too long. It was too micromanaging. I mean, I remember doing projects back in the 80s, and we spent 3 months doing requirements, and then maybe a year doing development, and then we did another 6 months worth of testing. But by the time it was ready, you're 2 years in, and a lot could have changed in that 2 years. So that's why waterfall was got the sense of being a very heavy kind of methodology. And entities wanted to find some more agile, more adaptive type of approach to developing software. And to remind everybody that agile grew out of the software environment, but what we've seen that is can be used for things non-software related. And then in the mid 90s, we started seeing the establishment of Scrum, extreme programming, crystal clear. And then right around the turn of 2000 is when the Agile Manifesto became a reality. And that's when the big push for the whole Agile methods, we started seeing that in organizations. So what is that Agile Manifesto? Agile basically says we're going to focus on individuals and interactions. So we're going to look at how we work with each other. We also want to make sure we have working software. Well, I think everybody wanted to have working software. Just how quickly are you seeing working software, right? We wanted to be able to respond to change better than the way that the waterfall approaches required, because you had to do your requirements, and then once those requirements done, you had to develop those requirements, but you didn't really have the option to make any changes in the interim. And then the Agile Manifesto talks about having more customer collaboration. We're going to go through each of these in a bit more detail, but just to give you the comparison to how a traditional waterfall approach might be, is where it was very much structured around the process of managing that project, the process of getting the requirements, the process of development. So it was much more process oriented. We wanted to make sure that we had really good documentation in order to follow it and to deliver on it. We also wanted to follow a plan. We wanted to put a plan in place, and we wanted to deliver that plan by a specific date. And that's a lot of what the whole waterfall approach does, is it gives you that vision or that picture of, how are we going to get there? And where Agile is going to be very different. And you'll see that as we talk through this today. The other thing that more waterfall addresses more contract negotiation. Like, I want it done by this date. I want it done by this cost. It was much more strict with regard to those parameters and those constraints for the project. And so if you're thinking about this and how they're very different, it's like you work in an organization that, you may not be able to do 100% agile because you might have some of those constraints. And that's what we've seen over the last 20 plus years, is that Agile and Waterfall really need to work together to have the best option for our clients and for our organization, and to provide the best results. So let's delve into the Agile approach a little bit more and talk about how it's different than the waterfall. So Agile talks about self-organization. So Agile expects, and we're talking pure Agile, that you're going to have a team, and that team is going to work on that project together, and that they're going to figure out how to best utilize the resources they have in the time that they're working together. And there is that whole concept of 100% dedicated resources to an Agile project. The team is with that project for the duration. There aren't people coming in and out. So it's expected that this team will figure out how to work together to deliver on the requirements for that project. That assumes then that there's going to be a lot more motivation. People want to have more control over what they're doing. People want to participate in teams. They want to interact with each other. So Agile really, advocated for co-location. And we all know where that's gone in the last couple of years, right? Paired programming, which means you have two people working on the same, code to try to figure out the best way to approach something. So there's motivational aspects of an agile team. There's checks and balances as part of the co-location and the paired programming, that people are working together on a regular basis, and hopefully that it's not just siloed and one person's delivering something and then it doesn't work as expected. So individuals and interactions was one of the primary differences between an agile approach and a waterfall approach. The second difference is the concept of working software. Now, we all want the software to work. It's just when, so the working software as it applies to Agile is that each sprint, each iteration, you should have something that is actually able to be a production or a prototype, a usable piece of code that the client, the end user, can look at and comment on. So prototypes are critical, demonstrations are critical, incremental user acceptance is critical. So rather than waiting 6-8 months to see something to be tested, the expectation is that in Agile, you're doing it, that same process, in a very short time frame, and each sprint we're delivering working software, we're delivering a prototype, we're delivering something that can be tested and validated in that sprint. So working software, it's just how fast are you delivering to it. Now that does provide challenges too. Steve, you've probably talked to this. It's like, I've got a 2-week sprint and I want to get a certain amount of work done. I want to have some sort of feature completed, and it may not be feasible to get all of it done. So then you got to think about how to break it up into different sprints. So it's not that it's not that easy to break things up into really small increments without some thought. So part of the sprint, you have to put that thought into, how best can I break up these things into pieces that I can demonstrate some sort of value to my end user at the end of the sprint.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, and the fact of the matter is, even if you're doing Agile, people have dates and deadlines and expectations around a lot of things. So totally agree with you, and totally agree that it helps having a motivated team to work on it, because you're asking them to really interpret the plan,
right?
On the fly.
So. Absolutely. This one I do really appreciate as it relates to Agile and Waterfall, is the ability to respond to change. In my example earlier, I said, 3 months of planning requirements, 6 months of development, another 4 months of testing. That's 13 months. And if the market has changed, right, that requires you to reassess what you're delivering, you want to be able to reassess as things happen. You can't be that stringent on, hey, these are the requirements, these are the only thing that we're going to do. But if something really changes, you should have the ability to do that. Now, I can argue that in Waterfall, you still have that ability. We've talked about that with regard to charters. And if something drastically does change in the market, the project manager does have the ability to say time out, and let's evaluate our scope and make sure that we are not delivering something that won't be usable when we're at the end. But in Agile, it actually talks about really being able to assess any changes as quickly as they might be occurring, and not wait for months before you make that determination that you might need to make some changes. And then change is always costly, right? So if you build something and you decide that you're going to change it, there's a lot of cost associated with that. So those iterations do allow for better response to change. In theory, it addresses, the cost of change compared to waterfall projects. And, it does, support continuous development. But then that also affects, on the negative side, it affects timing, right? So if you're always able to make a change as things happen, how can you know when the project's going to end? So then that's, again, there's benefits and pros and cons to these things. And, continuous development is great if you have no expectation to have to stop at the end. Now
Well,
there
and I
are,
think, yeah, and
go
I
ahead.
think that's why software companies like us, we do a lot of agile because we're never gonna be done, with our stuff. But if you're doing something where you're delivering a final product to a client in a professional services situation, then you don't really have that luxury of always going on and on and on and delaying things.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. A product development team really can do those sprints and that continuous development because you're constantly being introduced to new ideas and new ways of doing things, and maybe there was a couple bugs that had to get addressed, so you can always
Right.
continually bring those into the agile process, and based on their urgency, you can always fit them in.
Right.
So that is an excellent example.
But I think if you're delivering something for a client where it's $100,000 budget, and then you really can't just go on and on and on, and there are limits, a lot more. You know,
I've had, yeah, you have that conversation with the client, says, hey,
yeah,
we're just going to keep going until we
I know,
get it
right?
exactly right. I don't think they're
Well,
going to
yeah,
miss that check, right? I've never
right.
seen one do that.
No, exactly. But the other thing that I think is different about software and maybe any kind of tech thing is that you talk about requirements gathering for 3 months.
Uh-huh.
Well, a lot of times you need finished requirements and validated requirements before the next level of requirements can even be met. So the more you're doing requirements on mythical requirements, the more
Right.
likely you're going to actually have a change to those original. Like if just one thing isn't quite the way you thought it was after you execute it, well, now these subsequent requirements don't matter anymore, and you waste your time
Yeah.
developing requirements on requirements on requirements that aren't validated yet.
But you can also see that same thing happen within the sprints, because you
Right.
could, assume that, here's how we're going to develop this little piece. And you get to the end, then you realize it really didn't quite do what I wanted it. So
Yeah.
you have the opportunity in the next sprint to change it up. But, agile does not mean you never do rework. It's just you're probably doing it quicker. And, then ultimately it saves on cost.
Yeah, and then one other thing you mentioned earlier was the idea of pairing people up. And one of the things we've done here in our company is with the engineers, we encourage the engineers to like present their work to each other internally,
Hmm.
so that they're cross validating. Like, I think the best thing for an engineer to do is have to show what they've done and demo it, because when you demo it, then it's like it's just a higher level of validation. So by pairing people up inside the sprint to say, okay, I'm going to show developer A is going to show his work to developer B and vice versa. Hopefully the objective is that they would vet each other's stuff before it goes to the next level, like the client or the
Right.
product manager or whomever's overseeing the whole project.
Right. Absolutely. No, that's a great example. And the fourth value is customer collaboration. So having the customer see the work as you're progressing has huge value. It really does. The tools that we have today, enable more of that real time realization of what those thoughts. So, a customer could say, what do you think about this? And maybe this will work better, but you're not really sure. So Agile allows for that discovery to happen without having to be so theoretical. So, to your point, Steve, about the requirements, before it was like you had to kind of think through all of those use cases and those alternative paths and try to, visualize what the end user is going to experience. And most of the time that's unattainable to be able to visualize it, 5 months in advance, right?
Right.
So being able to have the customer collaborate, participate in the effort on a regular basis is a really huge benefit to adopting some agile methods and agile approaches. And but it does take time. And if you are going to include your customer, I also know many customers that you think it's going to be a 15-minute call, And then it ends up being a 40-minute call or a 2-hour long call because we didn't think of everything and they started,
Yep.
thinking about more things that they can do. So, including the customer in those conversations is a little bit of a double-edged sword because you want that feedback, but you also don't want to derail the conversation. And many times that happens, right?
Yeah, no, a lot.
Pesky customers, right? They
Well,
want
I
it
mean,
all.
you want to do what's best, so
I
that's
know.
the challenge. But as long as, again, if for a software company like us, where sometimes a suggestion is just another investment, you know, where we're going to keep making our tool better and better and better,
Mhm.
that's a lot different than, again, they only have $100,000 to spend on this piece of software that you're making. So it
Right.
does depend even within software. And, we haven't even talked about using Agile for other non-software things, that people are trying to do that with.
Right. Well, and it comes down to you got to try to use the best of both worlds, and there's differences in the values, but I still believe the process is very similar. Um, it's just the values are different. So that's where this little chart comes in. So if you look at a typical waterfall software development, you're going to do your analysis, you're going to do your design, you're going to do your coding, you're going to do your testing, you're going to do your deployment, right? But you're going to do it once, right?
Right.
But in Agile, you're going to do those 5 steps multiple times, just in smaller iterations, with the expectation that there's some deliverable that comes out of
Mhm.
each of those iterations that can actually be demonstrated, tested, and moves us towards the um, end product that we're trying to get to. So in my mind, it's still a lot of the same thought processes, just in a shorter time frame.
Mhm. Yeah, like compressed, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and doing 10 iterations doesn't necessarily mean that 10 iterations is going to be less costly than doing one iteration. It could be more costly. But the expectation out is if I did the 10 iterations, the chance that the customer is going to be very happy with what the final outcome is should be increased. So that's the theory, right? If
Mhm.
I've involved the client more, I've done this in iterations, I've got a dedicated, motivated team that are working together 100% of the time, all the time together. Nobody's having to deal with capacity issues or people that are coming in and out of a project. Then the theory is that even though it might take more iterations, the quality of the outcome should be better.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely.
Yeah, so I mean, it comes down to you know some basic differences, and like I said earlier, is like Agile's more about that value. What do I get at the end? Um, the resources and the time for the sprint are fixed, but not for the overall deliverable, especially if you have a contractual project. Features, you estimate your features, but in waterfall, you're trying to estimate the overall resources and time.
Mhm.
So that's something to kind of pull out of this conversation here. It's each sprint you're thinking about a feature and making that feature work. And over on the waterfall side, you're looking at all those features and saying, what do I need to make it all work? So it's probably a lot more vague, to be able to do good estimating on the waterfall side. Were you going to say something?
No, I'm just agreeing.
um, and and the project manager role is expected to be a bit different, and that's where these last couple bullets are. The project manager, rather than directing and managing the work based on the plan, the role of the project manager in a pure agile um, situation would be really to facilitate the delivery of that code each sprint, each iteration, and to serve the team members. So where a project manager on the waterfall side might be doing you know, more comprehensive risk assessment, looking at all the risks that are out there, trying to put plans in place to address those risks. In the Agile, it's more about what obstacles do you have now, right? What are you hitting up against that's stopping you from being successful? So it's a little bit more real time. That's one of those things where it's also, what's the right word? Where it's in the moment, not necessarily thinking about the future. So I do kind of lean a little bit more on the waterfall side when I'm thinking about risks rather than worrying about the risks in that particular sprint. I do try to look at the risks for the overall project and keep those in mind. So I don't think risk management totally goes away, but the way the project manager addresses it is different, where they're really kind of trying to assess each sprint. Do we have any risks to address?
Yeah.
And
Do you find that the project manager in an agile role, are they more like a participant, or are they closer to the work there, or is it just kind of the same? I mean, you mentioned them serving and facilitating. Would that mean that maybe the project manager does a lot more testing or validating the work?
that's an excellent question. I've not really thought about that. I've seen it both ways. I prefer that a project manager is not just the paper pusher, right?
Right.
I want the project managers to really understand the requirements, what we're trying to deliver, how does the business want to use it, really understand the value to the agile side. What's the value we're bringing to the table for our client, and help make sure that everybody understands that and we are delivering it. So, that may mean in your organization, you got to get way down in the weeds. And in other organizations, you don't have to. That probably depends on the team you've got. But
Yeah.
I much prefer having a project manager that really focuses in on ensuring that the team is delivering the value the client's expecting.
Hmm. Yeah, that's good. That's good advice.
So I think so. The next thing we're going to do is really talk about some hybrid options, and the two use cases that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to hand the reins over to Steve here for a second, is basically a single project. We're going to talk with multiple development sprints, kind of what I was just talking about, and we're going to compare it to um, um, an example that Steve has where he has multiple projects that are dependent on one single product sprint. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Steve.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, I guess we'll just talk through that a little bit. So if you're just a software company, um, making a product, then you probably just have a single project. Like, there's some other tools out there too work this way. The project really never ends. It just goes on and on and on, and you continue to make the software better. And what we're talking about here, and I'm just going to use our company as an example, is we have development objectives for our product Project Insight all the time. So there is a track for that where we have things that we in our backlog that we know we want to do that are part of our roadmap, that are things going on. And then at the same time, being that our tool is pretty customizable in that we do a lot of professional services around our company, we've got waterfall projects that are being run by the success teams that they're training people, it's a schedule, there's trainings going on, there's tasks dependencies going on, but during those onboardings you uncover, oh well, we need to do this little tweak to the product, or we need to do this little custom report for them. And most companies, I think, are like this. We don't have a special development team for every single success adventure going on. We have the same team, basically matrixed, doing everything around the product, whether it's a feature for somebody, or whether it's something in a project that we're doing for a client, during onboarding, or an existing client. So what you're seeing here out of Project Insight right now is just a regular burn down chart. The only difference in this burn down chart from any other kind of burn down chart and maybe other tools is that this particular sprint is covering multiple different projects going on. So here we have multiple deliverables for each different client going on, some DevOps things and some customer things. This allows the development team to see, here's what we want to do in the next 2 week and a half across this particular sprint. But as they work in the tool, it updates the waterfall project. So we actually have waterfall projects that have backlog tasks that go in the sprint all at the same time, and they can, this way the PMs can see their projects in their view, and then the development team can see projects in their view. So I think this is a pretty common scenario that a lot of software companies have, where you have a team that's not just on one single product all the time, working on one thing forever and ever and ever, that they are a matrixed development or IT organization requiring their own timelines. Because in our tool, the timelines follow the sprints follow what version we're trying to release.
Mm-hmm.
And so then what happens is the success team can say, hey, I need this feature or this thing that we promised somebody in such and such a sprint. There's a meeting that we get together with the success people and the dev team, and we decide, okay, this is in and this isn't in, this is out, this is in. They go through each of the backlog items and decide, is it in or out? And then it's the goal of the dev team to do all that work. So I think that that's a common scenario. And the other scenario is you start off with maybe a Kanban style project where you don't know everything. You go into a waterfall modality, and then you go into a sprint, and then you go back to a waterfall. I think that's a common thing we see too, where there's times where you have a project that it's not that the project stays a methodology the whole time. You use all the methodologies as you go. Like you might be going into Kanban and then waterfall, then Agile, and then back to waterfall again. Maybe at the very end of your software product, you've got to roll out some hardware in a bunch of stores. Then you're back. You made the tech piece in Agile, but then now that the tech piece is ready to go, you have a waterfall schedule of rolling it out to every store. If you're like, some kind of retail outlet or a restaurant or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really, the fact that the Project Insight tool can support those different and varied types of engagements is great. And we have the burn down chart. So for when you're doing your sprints and you want to monitor those particular sprints, you can see, how you're progressing to that. And I love the fact that you can then, at the end of that sprint, you can automatically update all of the dependent projects that might be sitting as waterfall. And, then they can continue down their path, because, I think you mentioned it earlier, Steve, there's years ago when this all started, everybody wanted to do everything Agile.
Right.
And then it's like, well, it doesn't quite work that way. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't know many organizations that can put dedicated resources on a project team, like 100% dedicated. To your point, the product team might be.
Yeah.
But not on your professional services or any kind of custom, because it could be that your types of resources you need, if I have 3 developers on a team and 2 analysts and 1 QA person, but it's very complex and I need an extra developer, I can't just make a business analyst an extra developer. That doesn't work that way. And I might have some people sitting around without work to do, because the expectation is that those teams are working full time on that project. So the fact that we have swung that pendulum to, like, we want to do everything Agile, and then trying to figure out and have tools like Project Insight that can support that hybrid model is great, because I think that's, we need to have those options.
Yeah, I think that's the future is definitely, you don't want to go in and say, well, what kind of project am I doing? And then you're locked into that methodology. And then the other challenge that I think people end up having is you end up having to double enter the work, because you're using one tool for one team and another tool for another team. Why do that if you don't have to?
Right.
But this isn't all about the tool. It's definitely about the processes, and that's how you should be looking at it. Whether
the tool needs to be able to support those processes.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. We have any questions from the audience on this?
No, they're being quiet today in there.
Oh, no. Oh no. Well,
Patty.
All right, so I'm going to put my screen back up here. So give me a second.
Go for it.
Can you see it?
Yep.
All right. We're learning how to hand off on it's all good. But so one of the things people always ask, and we've talked a bit about it already, is when should I revisit trying to have a pure agile approach? So that means like if I really want to do agile and I'm trying to do agile, but certain things come up that it historically has not proven to be the best approach, would be a research and development project. Most of the time, research and development, you know, it's about the brainstorming of it, and that brainstorming might take a long time. It might the research might take a long time. So forcing research to be time bound into a sprint and making decisions on that research may not be the best approach to use an agile approach, because it could be, I have to do a study, so R&D kind of projects tend to not be good candidates for agile. And we said earlier, if you've got clients or you've got constraints to the scope, to the cost, to the time, to the quality, if you have hard constraints, then you should absolutely consider more of a hybrid approach. But having a pure agile will probably fail, especially if you've got clients that are expecting something to be delivered on a certain time. Or let's say, a current version of the software is obsolete by the end of 2023, and you have to make changes by the time that software becomes obsolete. You can't just go beyond that obsolescence date on your own. So when you have those kinds of constraints, you really have to think about, should I have some sort of blended, some sort of hybrid approach?
Yeah, I mean, I would think that, even like I was saying, that I would think that the hybrid approach is probably, even more common than that. And I do have a comment in there that says, please provide a hybrid example in software. And I think I mentioned it earlier, where if you're doing software development for a product and you've got your ongoing requirements that you have for yourself, but maybe you have a lot of clients. Like, that's what I was saying. In our company, we use the hybrid method for software development because we have objectives on our roadmap to get done. But every week when we're onboarding new clients in Project Insight, we get some feedback from on clients that require development resources. Like, they might need to build a special report for someone, or we might need to fix a bug that we found during onboarding, or we might need to add a minor feature. Then those other projects, I'm saying the onboarding project is actually what's causing the software development itself to be hybrid.
Right.
And then I think the other example we talk about with hybrid is, if you have, maybe you're just a software company, but you're doing multiple different product lines at the same time with one team, then you might want to use a hybrid approach where you're merging a sprint that has two different products going on at the same time, because they have to be delivered together. That's probably not as common. And then I think what you're just mentioning here is, the more you have a constraint, is what I heard you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the more you have a constraint of cost or timeline, the more you need to be in a hybrid approach where there's some parameters. Because it seems like in Agile, it's kind of like, well, if we don't get this thing done in the sprint, we just move it, and
Right.
So executives don't like that.
Right.
They really don't,
No.
because they want, and the other big thing too is, we could have a whole webinar on this, but we're not going to. But we could talk about story points versus effort versus, and we see it all the time on the front lines with our clients. Like, what's a story point? Like, executives don't like that.
Right.
Because
Well,
at the end of the day, it's money and time.
yeah, I thought of a good example from a quality standpoint. So if you're thinking of Agile projects, you're wanting to deliver, working code, right? And Steve, I don't know if you're actually deploying the code into your production environment every week.
No,
But
that's
if
what it is. For us, each sprint is a release to production.
Yeah, so
Mhm.
think about that in a healthcare environment
Yeah.
where maybe, like, I worked at a company one time that we did infusion therapy software, which is basically the IV bags and the calculations to how to fill those IV bags. I wouldn't want to do that kind of project in an Agile and move that code into software without
Hmm.
thorough testing, because you could kill somebody, right? So if there's an error in the calculations, I'm not moving that to production. So when I talk about quality, it's about how much testing do you need before you can actually put it into production. So, and how big is that scope? Where are those tentacles? So when you have really complex systems, it is really hard to just push things into production on a sprint cadence. One of the clients I work with now, they're a large um, not carrier, a large clearing firm in the country, and um, they'll do sprints. They have 2 week sprints, but they don't deploy to production until they have enough of those sprints done, and then they schedule a regular UAT testing.
Right.
So they follow a sprint cycle, but then there's a full user acceptance testing cycle before they put it into production, because you're dealing with people's money, right? You don't
Right.
want to have a zero point zero 0.01, error on somebody's bank account, right? So unless it's in my favor, that's be good. But right? But you don't want that. So there are times when the quality is critical and you can't just push things in to production.
Right. So I think, yeah, I'm going to regurgitate that a little bit back. I think you're talking about the scenario where maybe you start off in waterfall, and then in
Uh-huh.
the middle of it, you're doing releases of prototypes, not the
Mhm.
final end goal.
Right.
Because especially if it's a more than a year long effort, that you may be in agile then, and then you switch back to the waterfall for the final go
Correct.
live. So that's another kind of hybrid software example
Absolutely.
use case.
Yep.
So
And again, that
yeah, I actually think that you're never pure agile unless there's literally no timeline, and you have resources are able to just keep going on and on and on. Like I don't see why any like work for hire isn't at least hybrid,
I agree.
because yeah.
I agree. I mean, the theory is great. I think what I see is so few companies can have dedicated resources. That's
Right.
probably the main reason why you don't see it. Because there's specialists that are needed for those efforts, and those specialists, you're not going to have them sit on a doing work that's doesn't require their specialty
Hmm.
when they're probably a high cost resource, right? So you want those specialists to be able to to use their specialty across many efforts.
Right.
So that's probably another big reason why you
So if you have
really.
matrixed development team where they just are covering all kinds of things, then you're probably going to be in a hybrid mode most of the time, at
Absolutely.
least. At least.
Absolutely. And
So
then the last little bullet here, why you
yeah.
wouldn't use pure agile is, if you really, like you mentioned about professional services, we don't want our professional services projects to go forever. So
Unless
they
they're paying forever.
well, unless, but
I mean,
then that's not a,
I know,
that's
right?
not
No,
the same
which
thing,
that's
right?
not realistic.
So when they have to close out, I mean, it'd be great if you had 10 clients and those clients keep paying
Yeah,
you to do development. Okay, fine, but then
yeah.
at some
No, I
point,
know. I mean, if you're like a restaurant or something like that, and you need some software done, and you're not a software company. They do not. Te- I In my entire career, I have yet to see a company that wants a piece of software for some kind of efficiency or whatever they're trying to do. Usually, there's a budget limit on
right,
that.
right,
So anyway,
absolutely.
yeah. So we can move on, I guess.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're almost to the end here. So,
Yeah.
and so anyway, thinking about your own projects, so as you get a new project, and I think what you heard from this webinar today is that it's really, you're not seeing pure agile or pure waterfall nowadays. It really is a combination, it is this hybrid approach. And, you know, to what extent do you have to do that on your project? And I think there's some things to consider when when you get your project the first time. So the first thing is, you know, based on the last slide, do I have a project where agile kind of methodology might be appropriate? So if the answer is yes, okay, great. Do I have support from senior management and product owner to run that agile project? And support means that they're involved. We are going to share a fun little video. There's a YouTube link that we'll share with you that kind of goes through this, and it kind of highlights some of the challenges you might have if your organization hasn't done any kind of agile projects before. So you really need to get their buy-in and you need their involvement, right? And the organization also needs to be open to change, because an agile process is very different than a waterfall process. So if your organization is used to that waterfall, it'll be a change. We all know that change is hard, right? And the next bullet here is what we've been talking about most of this webinar, is just the release dates are kind of ambiguous in Agile. So if you don't have a firm date, if the company is, if you're trying to deliver iterative features, then Agile might make sense, and because it might take a little bit longer than you anticipate to get to the end. Definitely plan more time. We always forget, I've said it about talking to your clients, 15-minute call with the client maybe end up really being a couple hours. You want to do those demos. People underestimate the amount of time it takes to prepare for demos, to deliver demos, to receive the feedback. All that stuff takes time. So you have to put that into your overall sprint planning. And then people have to be willing to, I just found a typo, shoot, willing to see demonstrations of work in progress that are not final. So your end user needs to realize that what you're showing them is a very specific scope and a very specific deliverable. It is not everything, so again, that's a change. So moving from waterfall approaches to agile approaches does take time and effort, and you're going to have to think through these before you get started, because you can't just jump right into it and turn all of the current processes over in a day and expect people to succeed with it. The company I'm working with now, it's, we started really trying to do an agile methodology probably around 2 years ago. And we've had iterations of it. It took at least 6-8 months for people to really kind of get into a routine. Now they're in that routine, but we're always finding things that probably need to change. We have a product group that functions a lot more like what Steve was saying, and then we have professional services group, which is slightly different kind of pod, but they're doing. But all of the groups are doing a very much of a hybrid approach. Mm-hmm. And, it's just, you have to figure out what works for your organization and for your clients.
Yeah, you definitely want to keep looking at what you're doing and evaluate it and not get locked into something. So,
and that's what all those retrospectives are for, right?
Yes.
So you can adapt to change on a regular basis. And, it is getting better. I mean, I have to admit that, people have adopted it and they're seeing the results, but there's always going to be things to work through.
Yep. We have about 10 minutes to go at the most. So, I think we're wrapping it up here.
Yes, we are.
So if there's any questions out there that you want to throw into the comment box, we'll take them. Otherwise, we're going to wrap this up here. You can claim your PDU there by grabbing the link. And yeah, it was definitely a good conversation on Agile versus Waterfall versus it'll be interesting to see, as we progress in project management, what the next cool thing is going to be. We certainly don't hear um, as much anymore about, hey, it's all agile, but it was for a while there, like the whole business wants to be agile because the word is synonymous with being high tech or being on
Right.
the leading edge. But the leading edge is definitely always different than what's maybe being hyped at all times.
Gotcha. Yeah, agreed. It's a buzzword of the year or for the last 20 years.
Definitely. Well, in software for sure, but yeah, it's funny that try building a building with agile, right? You're not gonna
Yeah,
see
you
that.
still have to wait the days for the concrete to cure. Um,
Yep, definitely. So, all right. Well, I think that's about it. I don't see any questions in the box. So,
okay.
thanks everybody for attending. Next month we have switching PM tools gracefully, and then in April we have coming up 5 keys to managing any project. Both of those webinars will be for PDU, which you have to be attending the live version to get the PDU. We do post these webinars later, but we don't have the link in there after a while because of you have to we have to comply with the PMI rules. So thanks everybody for attending. And if you need to follow, we'd love to follow Project Insight on LinkedIn or Instagram or Facebook. Those are our links right there. Go to our website, projectinsight.com. If we have a free version of Project Insight out there that anyone can try. And also we have our enterprise, which is what most of our clients we have in our enterprise tool. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.